Welcome back, everyone. It's been a great day, and it's about to get even greater. Graham Carr, President and Vice-Chancellor of Concordia University, and Celine Cooper, Director General, Consortium of English Language CEGEPs, Colleges and Universities of Quebec, are on my left. Imagine a fireplace. We're going to have a fireplace chat. Through their back and forth, Graham and Celine will provide a high-level view of the current state of Quebec's post-secondary education economy, the sustainability of its institutions, and possible paths forward. Thank you very much.
We're working? Good. Welcome. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's plenary session. I'm really excited to be here at the QUESCREN Forum. This is the third or fourth forum that I've had the pleasure of being involved with, and it's always such a delight to be here. So our conversation today, we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Graham Carr, the President and Vice Chancellor of Concordia University. Graham, as you know, is widely recognized for his leadership in advancing higher education's role in innovation, research, and community impact in Quebec and across Canada. So thank you, President Carr, for joining us today. We will have 45 minutes together. We'll engage in a 30-minute exchange to explore some of the questions shaping our post-secondary sector with a lens on the English post-secondary sector, given the theme of the QUESCREN conference. We will look at things like workforce development and research to sustainability, policy, and the unique contributions that our English language institutions bring to our broader ecosystem. And at the end of the 30-minute exchange, we'll have 15 minutes for audience questions. So please keep those ideas in mind, and we'll come back to you at the end. So I'm going to just jump right into it. How would you describe the current state of Quebec's post-secondary education economy today?
Well, before I answer that, Celine, I just want to thank Lorraine and Brian and QUESCREN for the invitation to be here. Thanks everybody for coming out. It's great to see the interest in post-secondary, the interest in Anglophone institutions and their role in higher education, and I'm really proud and happy to have the opportunity to be here in front of the fireplace with all of you this afternoon. How would I describe Quebec's post-secondary? I mean, I would begin by saying that I think at one level, anyone looking at Quebec from somewhere else in the world would have to say that we're extremely fortunate to have the network of post-secondary institutions that we do in this province. I'm particularly familiar with the university sector. Obviously, the CEGEP sector is a unique entity unto itself, but you know, Quebec has built a lot of really strong universities, some dating back a couple of centuries, some much newer, many of which are recognized globally and highly ranked as institutions, highly ranked in particular fields of research. And I think it's important to keep all of that in mind, that we are living in a society and in a province which has, especially over the course of the last 60 years or so, placed a premium on the importance of knowledge and placed a premium on the importance of higher education and helping build those institutions. Unfortunately, in the current context, we are seeing and experiencing a lot of pressure on the system, and a lot of pressure on the system because notwithstanding the investments that Quebec has made and others have made in supporting the growth of our institutions over the last several decades, we remain comparatively underfunded in contrast to the university sectors in many, not all, but in many other parts of Canada. And in the current moment, as you are undoubtedly aware if you're reading the newspapers or following other media. There's a lot of pain that's being distributed through the post-secondary system. In our case, compounded by federal and provincial immigration policies, which have really led to a cataclysmic decline in our international student population and have very much changed who we are as a university. I can speak more to that later. I think one of the things which has always been unique about Concordia is that, in contrast, and this is just a contrast, it's not a criticism, but in contrast to the other Anglophone universities, we have always primarily served Québécois students. This year, the number is around 72% of our total student population are Québécois. And we have always been an important university of first choice for the Anglophone community and increasingly for the Francophone community across Quebec. But there's no question that Concordia and indeed the vast majority of universities right now in Quebec are experiencing a serious financial challenge. The vast majority of universities, including my own, are in a deficit situation which is not just annual now, but which is structural, and that's concerning, and it's concerning precisely because there's so much opportunity here and so much strength within the réseau, and we need to be building momentum, not retarding momentum in the context.
So I wonder if I could invite you to talk a little bit more about Quebec's post-secondary sector, the role of Concordia, and where this conversation around the institutional pressures that you face fit into the broader Canadian landscape. So there's been a big conversation right now about the stress that Canada's universities and colleges are facing with different economic challenges and so forth. And I wonder if you could sort of locate what's happening here into that broader Canadian conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened, Celine, over the last several decades is that there's been a real proliferation of universities in Canada. There are now, I think, 97 universities in Canada that are members of Universities Canada. In Quebec, the ensemble of Quebec universities is 18 and 19 if we count Collège Militaire Royal. That's a lot. And there's an enormous diversity in size and scope from Université de Montréal, which, if you include HEC and École Polytechnique, is a huge university with upwards of 70,000 students, to much smaller universities like Bishops or Université du Québec, Abitibi-Témiscamingue, which serve a few thousand students. And there are very different mandates that universities are trying to fulfill, some of which are research intensive, and I would put Concordia in that group. Others of which are far more oriented at teaching and learning. Bishops is a good example of that. Some of which are very much servicing regional populations. I mentioned Abitibi-Témiscamingue, but there's Chicoutimi, Rimouski also there. And other universities which have for decades, centuries, had a strong international profile. McGill is certainly an outstanding example, as is Université de Montréal. So there's a diversity, which is, I think, both a strength and a vulnerability of the higher education system in Quebec, and you can map that across the country. So over time, other provinces have also invested heavily in building up their university sectors, and often that has meant building satellite campuses or building campuses in regions to serve local populations. And I think now, one of the consequences that we're experiencing across the country is how we sustain those models going forward. And so there is a lot of effort to ensure that regional universities can survive, and that students are not drawn to the big cities of Montreal and Quebec City, for instance, and are siphoning students away from the regions. By the same token, the reality of demographics in North America is that there is a phenomenon of urbanization and densification that's happening, and younger people are part of that, in part because they see more easily, in many cases, see their future in urban centers. And in Montreal, we have a particular advantage because Montreal has always been seen as one of the best cities in the world in which to be a university student. Although that profile has changed over time. And, in 2017, Montreal was the #1 ranked city in the world to be a university student. This year, it's number 18. How has that happened in 8 years? We've gone from first place to 18th place, and that says something about how we are. It says two things. It tells us, on the one hand, that there are cities elsewhere in the world that are positioning themselves in a more favorable way than was the case in the past, but it also says that we're slipping, we're losing our position, and why is that? And I think that's one of the dangers, Celine, that's facing the whole university system in Canada right now, is a potential decline of the prestige and profile of Canadian universities in the world. And the single biggest cause of that, in my view, is the policies that have been introduced federally and provincially with respect to international students, limiting student visas, the kind of public messaging that has gone out, which has led to a cataclysmic drop in the number of students who are choosing to study in Quebec and Canada. And there are longer-term consequences of that. There are short-term consequences of that, not just for the financial health of our institutions, but for the financial health of the communities where those institutions are located. And there are longer-term consequences in terms of research and development opportunities, in terms of employment opportunities, and the talent needs of the workforce of tomorrow in Canada.
I want to stay with the challenges for a moment, and then I promise we're going to move into solutions and the positive things. But I want to talk a little bit more about the pressures that our universities, and in particular, Quebec's English-speaking universities, are under. So you've spoken about immigration and the policies around immigration, limiting international students. That's one really important factor. Another factor that I would like to invite you to speak on is around language policies and some of the challenges that English universities like Concordia are facing here in Quebec that adds to this general state.
Yeah, so it's no secret that we've had a bad run with the current government over the last few years.
So much more diplomatic.
It's and frankly, it started out of nowhere. It really started out of nowhere when the three at that time it was myself, Michael Goldblum from Bishops, Chris Manfredi was acting principal at McGill before the arrival of Deep Saini, and we were summoned to a meeting with the then Minister of Higher Education to talk about Francisization in Anglophone institutions, and to address the perception, which was very clearly held by the minister, that we were guilty of recruiting large numbers of students from the rest of Canada and other parts of the world who were then abandoning Quebec after graduation and going elsewhere. And then that was the opening conversation, which led to not very many more conversations. That actually just led to policy policies being implemented, which I think you know about, where out of nowhere, the tuition for students coming to Quebec to study only in English institutions, not the Francophone institutions, was going to be significantly increased. That numbers were floated around target Francisization rates for students coming from outside of Quebec, creating an impression in the minds of prospective students that they would be prohibited from graduating unless they had mastered French, or that their program would have to be prolonged by a period of time in order for them to master French. And at the same time, the government changed the funding formula. You know, the funding formula for universities is one of the most arcane things imaginable, but this was pretty clear-cut and pretty simple to understand. The government essentially decided that it was going to claw back between $17,000 and $20,000 of tuition that every international student paid to study in Quebec, and it was going to redistribute that money elsewhere in the réseau. And the pretext for that was, again, not data-driven. The pretext for that was the stereotype that it was the Anglophone institutions that were the primary recruiters of international students, that this was creating an unfair financial advantage for the Anglophone institutions, and that some equilibrium had to be achieved by reaching into the pockets of the Anglophone institutions and redistributing their wealth elsewhere. Of course, what happened was the combination of all of that rhetoric effectively collapsed the international student market. So we lost money on every student, and there wasn't any money for the government to take in to redistribute. So it was a lose-lose proposition. And unfortunately, it was also predicated on a falsehood. The reality is that growth in international student recruitment in Quebec over the last several years has been primarily in the Francophone sector, not in the Anglophone sector. In fact, if you were to look at Concordia University today, we have exactly the same number, almost to a head, as we had 10 years ago of international students. Of course, we've taken a beating in the last couple of years on that file. But it created an environment, Celine, where the message that went externally to a lot of students, and we saw it in declining attendance at open house. We saw it heard it in the correspondence between potential students and our counselors and our recruiters, et cetera. The perception was that Quebec just wasn't welcoming anymore. And then added on to that was the federal government announcement that it was going to reduce the number of study permits for international students, which just amplified the same message. And that message has, in a very short period of time, managed to destroy what was a very strong Canada brand in higher education beyond our borders. And it's managed to destroy that brand, or cripple that. Destroy is an exaggeration. Let's say cripple that brand at a time when, let's face it, not very many international students are interested in going to what was previously the single biggest destination, the United States. And we have managed to, instead of seize an opportunity, we are in the midst of squandering an opportunity. And the consequences of that, I think, are going to be medium term for the economy, particularly for governments such as the federal government announcing yesterday, a generational transformational budget that is very focused on development of leading edge sectors of industry and new industries, et cetera. You're not going to do that without brains. We have a lot of talented Québécois. We have a lot of talented Canadians, but we don't have enough of them to meet the ambitions of economic development that Canada and Quebec are setting for itself. And that's why it's important to be able to draw from elsewhere.
So how do you counter this perception then?
Not very effectively so far, is the truth. So, you know, we've tried to counter the perception. So let me go back to a couple of years ago when the focus was really on the Anglophone institutions. And we tried to counter the perception, I think, in two or three ways. One was to move away from representing ourselves or being stereotyped as Anglophone institutions and to try to position ourselves as what we are, which is Québécois institutions. Concordia has always been a Quebec university serving the entire population of Quebec, Francophone and Anglophone. The overwhelming majority of our alumni stay in Quebec and are concentrated in Montreal upon graduation and contribute to the thriving of Quebec society and economy, and that's simply a reality. So step number one is to try to disabuse the stereotype that we are somehow disconnected from Quebec society. Step number two was to try to counter stereotypes and policies with data. So in a period of misinformation and disinformation, especially when it comes to universities, can we at least have an evidence-informed conversation about what the landscape of higher education looks like, what the nature of our demographics look like, and so on. And we were not terribly successful at that. And the government went ahead with policies which led us, together with McGill, to launch a legal case. And, you know, I would never have dreamed in my worst nightmares that I would be launching a legal case against the government of Quebec, but such was the reality. And one of the things that for me was very revealing in the court judgment was the judge's outrage, and I think outrage is a fair word to use, at the utter lack of proof, data, and evidence to justify public policy. And I think that is a note to the citizenry as a whole. It was our fight this time around, but the fact that policies could be introduced based on fiction, which was the case, you know, how did you arrive at 80% as a target for francisization? But that was a question we'd asked. How can you say that? Anyway, I don't have to go through all of the data points. So the second thing I think was to try to correct the data or get the data out there about the reality. And the third thing was, in a way to come back to the first point, to focus on the positive contributions that the university makes to Quebec society. And those positive contributions are not just the more than $1 billion that the university injects into the economy of Montreal on an annual basis. That's a significant amount of money. But it's the contributions that our graduates go on to make by moving into the workforce here, or even if they go elsewhere or return to their homes, they continue to be ambassadors for the university and ambassadors, more importantly, for Montreal, for Quebec, and for Canada. It's a win-win. The government doesn't have to invest a cent in the primary and secondary education of the international students who come here. It doesn't cost them a cent for their health care because they can't get a study permit unless they have private insurance. They pay differential fees. Those differential fees are now recycled to support non-Quebecois students in other Quebecois students in other universities, and they go on to make a social and economic contribution. We have to tell that story that creates the impression that international students or students from the rest of Canada are not somehow freeloading on the system. They're contributing to the system. They're here for a reason. You know, I look at our faculty of fine arts, you know, 50% of whom are plus are francophones. But I look at the students who are coming literally from around the world and certainly from across Canada to study here. And they're coming here because of the quality of the faculty of fine arts. They're coming here because of the cultural and artistic scene in Montreal. That's the magnet. That's a positive thing. And so I think the challenge for us, and it's different for each university, and they have their own story to tell. The challenge for us is to communicate that. You know, you're sitting in the Molson building. Some of you may have seen a month ago that the John Molson School of Business was named by Bloomberg Businessweek as the #1 business school in Canada, with the top MBA program in Canada. That's great for us. That's great for Quebec. That's fantastic marketing. That's the first time that the Ivy School at Western Ontario has not been #1 in the country since I can remember. You know, these are enormous plus factors. So the strategy is to try to get those narratives out there, get those stories out there. But it's difficult because we're dealing with a baggage of stereotypes that are deep-seated and uninformed. It's hard to sustain the message because the news cycle is so crowded. One of the things that I'm most proud of my communications team about in that fall of 2023 was we kept the tuition and francization story in the news every single day from October until Christmas. That was an incredible accomplishment with a lot of coverage in Francophone media in particular. But it's hard. It's really hard.
So there's a lot at stake this is a room full of folks from government, from policy, from community, from post-secondary. We've got a really diverse group of folks here in the room. And these institutions, our post-secondary institutions, matter to our communities. I'd like to ask you who you'd like to see around the table. If we're going to come together to change this messaging and change this discourse, who needs to be at the table to do that? Or part of the conversation?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, I had an opportunity to give a talk to the Chambre de Commerce. I think the business community is an obvious choice. My message to them was really simple. I said, you know, what we're experiencing now with the decline in international students and the challenges for the government, it's my problem. It's our problem today. It's your problem 3 years from now. It's your problem 3 years from now when you go out to recruit. And suddenly the pool of applicants that you've become used to over time is smaller, less polyglot, less multicultural than you were expecting. And that's going to have a huge impact because increasingly the global competition for talent and the growth of the knowledge economy is the way of the future. And if you can look at what is going on in other parts of the world, you know, 10 years ago, Chinese students were flooding to Canada, the United States, parts of Europe. They are not coming in the same numbers today. Why? Well, partly because welcome mat has been out for them and been geopolitical issues. Also because Chinese students don't need to leave China to get a first-rate education anymore. And, you know, I travel to other countries like Malaysia or certainly Singapore. Students have choice now. And that global market for the 6 million or so students who every year are studying in a studying abroad on a study permit, that the competition for that market doesn't look at all like what it looked like a few years ago. And I realize I'm talking quite a bit about international students here. I'm not taking for granted the Quebec student population, but here's another challenge that we have. This year, because of a demographic bubble, Quebec University saw an increase in new registrations from Quebec-based students. At Concordia, we saw a 9% increase in Quebec-based registrations compared to last year. That was not because we were prioritizing international students or Ontario students over Quebec students previously. It's just that demographically, the numbers weren't there. Now the numbers have changed, but that bubble is going to end in 2030. You can see it. You can see exactly what's going to happen. And so to sustain the growth that all of our institutions are experiencing, and certainly the growth in our costs, because our labor costs keep growing and our costs of inflation, the cost of doing business keeps growing. The business model in Canada has been very simple for higher education. You would, and Brian remembers this from his days as a dean, you would start the year and you would forecast what your expenses were going to be for that year, and you knew what those expenses were because of the salary costs, et cetera. And then you went and got the revenues, i.e. you got the students to meet the expenditures. Well, we have to invert that now. We have to look at what our revenues are and figure out how we right size our expenses to our revenues, which is a more normal business practice. But in the university culture, because government funding was not keeping pace with the costs, the only way that you had to meet your growing cost package was to grow, to bring in more students, to bring in more revenue. And as the Quebec demographic reached a ceiling, you had to look elsewhere. And, you know, that's how the system worked. But we seduced ourselves into believing that there was a bottomless pit, you know, that there was an endless supply of students, because year after year after year, it seemed to be the case. And suddenly, when overnight you have 1-2 years of policy changes, there have been a dozen changes to federal and provincial funding and immigration policies that touch international students in the last 3 years alone. You can't run a business like that. You can't run a business where you're changing the rules for the consumers every 4 months. You're just going to lose them. And once you've lost them, you're going to have a hard time to get them back. And that's what I think is waiting for us in the next few years, is how do we bring those students back?
So that's a good segue into my last question before we'll open it up to the audience. Is exactly that. Where do you see this sector in the next 3 to 5 years? Things are changing very, very quickly. There's difficult decisions that are being made that have to be made. But do you have hope? I hope you have hope. Is there hope? Is there hope?
You have to, you know, if you're in the university business or if you're in the education business, you have to be hopeful. It's an evergreen business. You're in an enterprise that gets to welcome a new group of students, whether they're in grade 1, grade 8, first year CEGEP or first year university. They've got dreams, they've got passions, and your job, your aspiration is to help them fulfill those dreams and passions. So I think people, by and large, who are in the education business are hopeful, which doesn't mean there isn't a healthy degree of cynicism and skepticism, but I think people are by and large hopeful. I think the challenge right now, Celine, is to have a crystal ball for the next 2 to 3 years. Things have changed. If you had asked me, this is year 7 for me. I started in July 2019. You know what happens. March 2020, global pandemic, right? A few epidemiologists may have forecast that, but most of us sure didn't have that in the strategic plan. We come through that, you know, with the scars and the costs to show for it, and not very long after that, suddenly we're facing up with a government of Quebec, which is determined to make us smaller and determined to change how we've operated. And I really didn't see that one coming either. And now you've got all of the other disruptions, the geopolitical disruptions. So the sideswipe effect of bad Canada-China relations and bad Canada-India relations was that the two countries that were the primary sources of international students for Canada became kind of barren markets, right? Okay, nobody really, that was kind of out of our own control too. And now, you know, we have a geopolitical situation which is very unstable. And technological change, in particular AI, but not exclusively AI, which is having a massive, as yet unknown impact on the sector as well. So forecasting 2 or 3 years out is really challenging to do. I look at the federal budget from last night, and there's a lot of, it's a good news budget for universities across Canada because there are very significant investments in research, but I think some of those investments are over a 13-year period now. Like, what could happen in the next 13 years, right? On the other hand, the international student or the international news is not so great because the government is going to stay the course on reducing the number of permits for temporary visitors, and international students are classified as temporary visitors. So that's not great news for us. So I think there's just a lot of unpredictability in the system, and right now I think for a university like Concordia, there are really two strong messages. One is about diversifying our activities, diversifying our markets, and diversifying our business plan, changing the business plan of the university. If international students can't come to us, how do we go to them? How do we reach out to different, we're in the knowledge business, so how do we reach out to different cohorts of potential learners beyond the classic 18 to 24-year-old demographic at the undergraduate level? And I think, you know, one investment that Concordia has made over the last 15 years, which has certainly paid off in spades, is the investment in areas of research that are really leading edge areas of research. And it has allowed us to differentiate the university from other, in a very competitive environment. It's allowed us, you know, if I look at our recruitment of international students, or even the increase in students coming from the rest of Canada to Concordia now, the majority of that is at the graduate level, not at the undergraduate level. And they're coming because they're attracted by the research niche that we've built in fields like cybersecurity or electrification, battery development, by what we do in fine arts, et cetera. And I think we need to sustain that, because that's also where public funding lies, and that's where public-private partnerships lie, and we need to diversify. We need to diversify our sources of funding for the university, which is easier said than done. So in terms of forecasting, very hard to do, but I think, you know, universities have to right-size themselves for the future. The own growth model is over, as far as I'm concerned. We may need to have a conversation at Concordia about whether we should be a smaller university, not a larger university. I would never have imagined having that conversation at any point in the past 15 years that I've been in administration. We need to figure out how we position the university in a way that differentiates us in a crowded market, and in a way that is able to speak to the needs of Quebec on the one hand, but appeal to a much more global audience on the other. And And we are public institutions. Being aligned with strategic priorities of government also matters in terms of the research and development and economic plans of the future that governments have. In that respect, I think we're, and that's the last thing because I know we're up for questions, but that's one of the important hidden ironies of Concordia's relationship to the government of Quebec at the moment. I said earlier on that the choreography wasn't too good between us and the government. What I meant was the choreography wasn't good between us, the Ministry of Higher Education, the minister, and the premier. We had a very good relationship with the with the current Minister of Finance, who is then responsible for Anglophone communities. We've had an outstanding relationship with whoever has been the Minister for Economic Development and Innovation, whether it was Pierre Fitzgibbon previously or Christine Frechette now. We do things together. And why do we do things together? Because we're in the areas that are a critical part of Quebec's future. And so that's the unsung story or the untold story of the relationship. On the ground, many people within government recognize exactly how we're contributing in a positive way to this society. But there's another political layer where it's much more difficult to convey that message.
Thank you, President Carr. I'd like to open it up for questions. We have, it's 4 o'clock. We have 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so we've got time. The fire. We've got time for a few questions. Stephen.
Stephen Thompson, member of the programming committee, policy wonk, guy who hides out in his basement. I got a ton of questions. I've got one that I'll ask. Listening to you, do we have too many universities in Quebec? Do we have too many universities in Canada? If there is a move to bring down provincial trade barriers, could there be a move to integrate Canada's post-secondary network, rationalize it, and wouldn't that benefit the system before the Amazon of post-secondary education comes along, because you know it's coming?
Just out of curiosity, what were the other questions? It's a sensitive, okay. So it's a sensitive issue to talk about university mergers or too many universities. And I'm saying that as somebody who happens to be the president of a university that was created because of a forced merger in 1974 between Loyola College and Sir George Williams University. And I arrived here about 10 years after that merger had occurred and would watch for several years the continued ongoing battle between the forces of one institution and the forces of the other for the future of the new institution. So that's a very, very sensitive issue, and nobody should underestimate that. I think, if I was going to say there's one constituency to watch in Canada to see if this movie is how this movie is going to play out, I would watch Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is a relatively small province which has an enormous number of post-secondary institutions, many of whom are very small in demographic terms and quite niche in that they are essentially monodisciplinary. And the current government of Nova Scotia and the heads of universities are not really well aligned on a number of issues. So if I was looking to see whether there was a test case in the future, I think that's the province that I would look at. It's very difficult it would be very difficult, I think, for a government in this province to answer the question, are there too many universities? Because there's a large investment in securing the future of very small regional universities. You know, I do think about the question as it relates to Concordia. Would some future government decide that, you know, there was a different future for Concordia? I hope not. I think, you know, we have a very distinctive identity and a size and a weight that it hasn't insulated us from being targeted for certain things, but shouldn't put our future at risk. The other problem that we have, Stephen, is that in Canada, higher education is not a federal responsibility. So this is a constitutional issue. It's a provincial responsibility. Every province sets its own post-secondary policy. Every province decides how it's going to fund its institutions. Some provinces decide whether they are going to give specific institutions specific mandates and measure how they perform. And there's not a lot of, it's very difficult to move across. It seems to be very difficult to move across the country. I'll give you an example. In Europe, for many, many years, there's been a student mobility program called Erasmus Mundus, which I'm sure many of you heard, which allows students, you know, to go and study in another university in another country as part of their education. And the benefits of that are they're exposed to different cultures and all the benefits that come from student mobility. You know, the number of times we have tried to have a discussion, by we, I mean myself and some other university heads, about how we could foster an Erasmus program across Canada. It's just, we just never seem to get anywhere. I find that hugely disappointing. It's partly because in every province other than Quebec, students from elsewhere in Canada pay the same tuition as a student from the home province. So if a Quebec student goes to Ontario, they'll pay Ontario tuition. It's only in Quebec where there's differential tuition. So in a way, you create mobility just by having equal tuition for most of the population. I grew up in New Brunswick, let's say. I can go study in British Columbia. It's easy. And so there is probably, you know, if we were to start from the beginning and build a Canadian university system for the future, it probably wouldn't look like the system that we have now, but I'm not sure trying to spend the time and energy to imagine what a new university system could look like would be very fruitful. There would be so many obstacles to that and so many players who would not want to be part of that. It's difficult enough as it is to get consensus among universities, even on things which seem self-evident. We're not. So I don't think that that's an area where I would invest my energies trying to improve higher education in Canada. It may, in fact, be precisely the area where we should be investing energies, but I guess I'm just skeptical that we would get very far.
Other questions? Oh, all of a sudden, all at once. I see there.
Bonjour, mon nom c'est Sarah Megas de Mamie Merveille et Granny Wonderful, donc un nom bilingue pour un non-for-profit. You mentioned the issue between your revenue and your expenses and how you're trying to flip that. How can that translate into teachers being able to jump into initiatives without having to wait for the next cycle of approval that can also take time. Because I'd like to collaborate with teachers, but then they tell me, wait until next year, or maybe the following.
Ça, c'est une bonne question. So one thing I will say, some people have maybe heard me say this before, but one of the paradoxes of universities is that we are institutions that place a huge value on innovation, on creativity, and on discovery, except when it comes to how we operate, where we place a huge premium on inertia, consultation, reflection, consideration, process. You know, that's, you don't hear the phrase, the word nimble in the same sentence as university very often for a reason. And that's a problem that we have to confront right now, because the world is changing way too quickly. The expectations of students, the expectations of potential partners, our need for potential partners is growing, and we have to be far more responsive to that than we have been in the past. But we are heavily governed institutions, and for a good reason. It's partly about ensuring the transparency of things that happen within the university. It's partly about ensuring that there is a good governance process, that people aren't just, freelancing and making up their own rules. But it's also put us in a position where it's very challenging to move quickly. And that's a turnoff for partners elsewhere. That's a real turnoff for partners elsewhere. They want to get things done. And I think it's something that we need to address, because, if you were just there's a big debate about productivity in Canada and productivity in Quebec. I think if you were to ask about productivity in universities in terms of how we function as institutions, I'd be a little nervous about what that study would reveal, and for me, that's a concern, because we're living in a world of acceleration, and change is happening, and it's happening at a faster and faster clip. And we need to adapt to that. We need to be able to, we should be anticipating that and trying to get ahead of it, but I'm afraid we're behind it and just trying to adapt. And that's a problem across all entities. It's partly a size related issue. We're a large organization with, just under 50,000 students and somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 faculty and staff. That's a big enterprise. It's hard to change any large enterprise of that nature. I mentioned how universities have grown over time. One of the areas where we've grown is sort of in middle management, right? Just to handle all the processes that we have to. If I just think about our university, all the reporting that we have to do to government, the value added of which is in many cases highly questionable, but the time invested and the money invested is significant. I don't think that's good value for money. But that's something that we're stuck with, When I look at, how much money I am paying as a university in the current context to provide what are essentially primary healthcare services because of the challenges in the public healthcare system. And I'm sure you can ask any other university and CEGEP director, they're investing enormous amounts of money in student mental health and clinical services and so on and so forth. I look at the amount of money, I realize this is as an Anglophone institution in terms of our compliance with l'Office Québécois de la langue française, the fact that we've had to, recruit and hire additional lawyers just to manage all our reddition des comptes with the government of Quebec, that's money I'd rather be spending in the classroom. That's money I'd rather be spending in supporting the creation and the incubation of a new research lab. But I don't have a choice. We have to spend that. And I'm not all of those things. I'm not saying that those things are a misappropriation of funds. I'm not saying that, you know, of course, students need health services and so on and so forth, but something has happened in the system. When I was a student, when I was a young faculty member at the university, yes, we had student health services. That was if you tripped going down the stairs and, you know, cut your head, or maybe you needed an insulin injection or something like that. That's not what we are running now. We are running a full bore health clinic. And it's because the system around us is not functioning. And, you know, is that part of our is that a higher education mandate? I'm not so sure. But we're not going to be able to walk it back. I recognize that. But I'm not sure that's where we should, that's what the mission of universities should include.
We have time for one more very brief question.
I don't think that's the questions that are the problem. I think it's the answers on the time.
Lorraine.
What kind of research has helped you or could help you in what you're trying to achieve in navigating this system?
Navigating the public policy system?
Yeah,
Or-
the challenges you're describing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't want to duck the research question. I think what we actually really need is a communication strategy. I think we have not done a very good job as universities generally across the country in making it clear to Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde why we matter, what our contribution is to society and community. Sometimes it's the contribution that you make as an anchor institution in a community, creating jobs for people, student housing, so on and so forth. Sometimes it's the impact of the research that we do. And of course, it's the impact of the talent that we help to form who go on to be part of the workforce of tomorrow. And I'm afraid, Lorraine, that we just have not done a very good job selling the product. And maybe we've taken for granted that people would just assume they understand why universities matter. There's been all kinds of polling data that Universities Canada has done over the last couple of years. A year ago, it looked things were trending badly in terms of public perceptions of university. This year, it's a little bit improved. For me, and it's, you know, part of the experience of being a little bit taken for granted or not getting our story out was actually the challenge we had with the government of Quebec when there were relatively few other voices that stood up and were prepared to go public and say, this is wrong, what's happening here. And now, like all of you, I look at what's going on south of the border and I think to myself, my God, where are the huge corporates in America that are not standing up and trying to defend what has been one of the most enviable research and education systems in the world? Now, I realize, you know, the current president has targeted very selectively some high-profile Ivy League universities, But the silence has been pretty deafening in terms of people outside the university community standing up. Now, you could argue that that's because people feel exposed. They're concerned about, vengeance, etc. Whatever the case, it's not very reassuring. And I think we have a job to do as a collectivity in Quebec and in Canada to explain why we are an integral part of the society that we have successfully built over the years, and that we have the ambitions to grow and develop in the future. And unfortunately, I think we are also paying a bit of a price for having learned to cope with less. So we've learned to do more with less. We've learned to, do more on our own with our own resources. In Quebec right now, for us at Concordia, about 57% of our funding comes from the government of Quebec. We're a public institution. In some jurisdictions in Canada, it's about 30% or 25%. So the meaning of public higher education, publicly funded institutions has dramatically changed. And the last thing I'll say is we saw this, the canary in the coal mine, is what has happened in many of the state university systems in the US, where government funding has shrunk to as low as 11 or 9% of the budget in some cases. And these are still called public institutions. And there's been an inverse relationship between the decline in public funding and the increase in intervention in institutional autonomy, an attempt to influence and control curriculum, and attempts to influence and control where higher education institutions are going. And that's very concerning.
All right.
That up, no?
It is
We're
always,
optimists. We're optimists.
Well, yeah.
Remember?
it is always such a pleasure to speak with you. I always leave our conversations with so much food for thought. So thank you so much for joining us, for your generous offer of your time with us today. And I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking President Carr for being
Thank you
with
all
us.
for being here. Thank you, Celine.